March 14th, 1971, somewhere outside Bakersfield, California. The bus had broken down 2 miles from nowhere. Engine trouble, the kind that couldn't be fixed with duct tape and prayer, though the driver had tried both. Johnny Cash stood in the gravel lot of a roadside diner, watching the mechanic shake his head under the hood. The tour was supposed to roll into Fresno by sundown. Now, they'd be lucky to make it by midnight. The air smelled like diesel and dust. The sun was dropping fast behind the hills, painting everything in shades of copper and ash. Johnny lit a cigarette and watched the smoke drift toward the highway, where trucks passed without slowing. March in California could be cold once the sun went down. He pulled his jacket tighter. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. A waitress wiped down tables that didn't need wiping. A trucker nursed cold coffee in the corner booth, reading a newspaper 2 days old. And at the counter sat a man Johnny hadn't noticed at first, mid-50s, worn hands, eyes that stayed down even when the bell above the door rang. The fluorescent lights hummed. The radio played something low and forgettable. Johnny ordered coffee. Black. Always black. The man beside him didn't look up. His name was Earl Hodges. Johnny learned this only because the waitress said it when she refilled Earl's cup. "You need anything else, Earl?" she asked, her voice carrying the familiarity of someone who'd served the same customer 100 times. Earl shook his head. "I'm fine, Dorothy." But he wasn't fine. Johnny could see that. Earl worked nights at a canning factory 20 miles south. He'd been sitting at that counter for an hour, stirring sugar into coffee he never drank. The spoon clinked against the ceramic in a rhythm that never varied. Clink. Pause. Clink. Pause. Johnny could feel it, the stillness that comes before something breaks. The pressure building in a man who's carried too much for too long. Earl's hands trembled when he lifted the spoon. Not from age, not from cold, from something deeper. Dorothy leaned in close, her voice low enough that only Earl and Johnny could hear. "Earl, you want me to call someone? Your wife? Pastor Henderson?" Earl shook his head. "No one to call." She looked at Johnny then, a glance that said, "Help him if you can." Then she retreated to the kitchen, leaving them alone at the counter. Johnny didn't know this man. Didn't owe him anything. The schedule was tight. The band was restless. Carl Perkins was probably already wondering where he'd disappeared to. But Johnny had spent enough years in his own wreckage to recognize the shape of it in someone else. He'd seen it in bathroom mirrors at 3 in the morning, when the pills wore off and the truth came rushing back, in the faces of men who'd lost their way and didn't know how to find it again. He turned on the stool. "You all right, friend?" Earl's jaw tightened. He didn't answer right away. His thumb traced the rim of his coffee cup. Around. And around. Like he was trying to wear a groove into the ceramic. Like if he just kept moving, he wouldn't have to think. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I did something I can't take back." The words hung in the air between them. Johnny had heard confessions before. In prison yards where men spoke through chain-link fences about the wives they'd abandoned and the children who wouldn't write back. Backstage in cities he couldn't remember, where musicians told him about the songs they'd stolen and the friends they'd betrayed. Late-night hotel rooms where the walls were too thin and the silence too loud, where strangers knocked on his door because they had nowhere else to turn. People told him things they wouldn't tell a priest. Maybe because they knew he'd been where they were. Maybe because they'd heard the darkness in his songs and recognized it. Maybe because they hoped he'd found a way out and could show them the path. He never claimed to have answers, but he could listen. Earl's story came slow, halting, like pulling splinters from beneath the skin, one at a time, each one drawing blood. He'd been a foreman at the factory for 16 years. Good job. Honest work. The kind that put food on the table and kept the lights on and let a man hold his head up in church on Sunday. He had a wife, Martha, married 31 years. 2 grown daughters who'd both gone to college, something he'd never had the chance to do. A grandson on the way. He was the kind of man people respected. The kind who showed up early and stayed late. The kind who remembered birthdays and never missed a shift. But 6 months ago, everything changed. A kid, 22, just married, new father to a 3-month-old girl, had gotten his hand caught in the conveyor. Tommy Brennan was his name. Good kid. Worked hard. Always wore his wedding ring, even though he wasn't supposed to, on the floor. Earl had been the one to shut down the line, the one to call the ambulance, the one who stayed with Tommy in the loading bay while they waited, holding pressure on the wound with a shop rag that turned red too fast. Tommy kept saying he was sorry. Kept asking if he was going to be okay. Kept asking about his daughter. The ambulance took 23 minutes to arrive. Earl counted every one. Tommy lost 3 fingers. The ring finger, the middle finger, and the index finger on his right hand. Gone just below the second knuckle. 2 weeks later, the company sent a man in a suit. Corporate safety inspector. He'd never worked a day on a factory floor. Never felt the heat of the machines, or the weight of responsibility that came with managing a line. He had a clipboard and a report that needed signing. The report said Tommy had been careless. That he'd bypassed a safety guard. That he'd violated protocol. It was a lie, and Earl knew it. The guard had been broken for 2 months. Earl had reported it 3 times. Each time, maintenance said they'd get to it. They never did. But if Earl said that, if he told the truth, the company would be liable. The lawsuit would be significant, and there would be consequences. The suit made that clear, without saying it directly. People would lose their jobs. The factory might even close. And Earl, as the foreman who'd filed those reports, would be the first to go. Earl had a mortgage, car payments. His youngest daughter's wedding was 4 months out, and he'd promised to pay for it. His wife needed a surgery her insurance only partially covered. The man in the suit put the pen down on the table between them. We all have responsibilities, Earl. Sometimes we have to make hard choices. Earl told himself it wouldn't matter. That Tommy would get workers' comp anyway. That the kid was young. He'd adapt. He'd find something else. That someone else would have signed if he hadn't. That he had his own family to think about. He signed. The ink was barely dry when he felt something inside him crack. Tommy's wife, Sarah was her name, came to see him 2 weeks later. She didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't threaten. She just stood in his driveway on a Tuesday afternoon with her baby on her hip and asked him one question. Why did you lie about what happened? Earl opened his mouth. Nothing came out. What could he say? That he was afraid? That he chose his comfort over her husband's truth? That he was a coward wrapped in the costume of a good man? Sarah waited. The baby gurgled. A car passed on the street. Finally, she nodded, like his silence had answered everything. She turned and walked away. Earl hadn't slept a full night since. I told myself it was just business, Earl said now, his voice cracking. That it didn't make me a bad person. That I had my own family to think about. That the system was broken anyway, and one man couldn't fix it. I told myself a lot of things. He looked at Johnny for the first time. His eyes were red and hollow, the eyes of a man who'd been staring at the ceiling for 6 months. But I can't sleep anymore. Can't look at my own face in the mirror. Can't sit in church without feeling like a fraud. Every time I close my eyes, I see her standing there, holding that baby, asking me why. And I don't have an answer. I don't have anything. His voice dropped to almost nothing. I don't even know who I am anymore. Johnny didn't speak right away. He'd learned that sometimes silence was the only honest response. That rushing to fill the space with words could cheapen what needed to be said. That a man bleeding from the soul needed time more than he needed advice. Outside, the mechanic knocked on the window and gave a thumbs up. 5 more minutes. The part was in. The engine would run. Johnny could have walked out. Should have, maybe. The bus was waiting. The band was waiting. Fresno was waiting. And after that, Reno. And after that, Portland. He had obligations. Contracts. People who depended on him showing up. But something kept him in that seat. Maybe it was the way Earl's hands shook. Maybe it was the desperation in his voice. Maybe it was because Johnny had sat in places like this, drowning in his own choices, and someone had stayed when they didn't have to. "You still working there?" Johnny asked quietly. Earl nodded. "Every night. Same shift. Same machines. I walk past that conveyor 50 times a night. You talk to Tommy?" "Can't." "He moved. Took his family to Oregon somewhere. His brother told me. Said Tommy needed a fresh start. Away from this place. Away from people like me." Earl's laugh was bitter and hollow. Johnny turned his coffee cup in slow circles on the counter. The porcelain scraped against the formica, a small sound in the quiet diner. "You ever think about telling the truth?" Earl's face went pale. His hands gripped the edge of the counter. "Now? What good would that do? Tommy's already gone. The company already won. The case is closed, settled, done. All I'd do is lose my job and prove I'm a coward and a fool." "Maybe," Johnny said quietly. Earl's hands stopped shaking. For a long moment, he just stared at the counter, at the coffee he'd never drink, at the reflection of the fluorescent lights in the chrome napkin dispenser. "Easy for you to say," he muttered. "You're Johnny Cash. You're famous. You've got money, options, people who'll hire you no matter what. You don't know what it's like to lose everything. To be nobody." Johnny smiled. But there was no humor in it. Just recognition. Just the weight of years spent carrying ghosts. "Don't I?" The truth was, Johnny had lost everything more than once. Lost it to pills that promised clarity and delivered fog. To pride that turned stages into prisons. To anger that burned through every good thing he touched. To the parts of himself he tried to bury under noise and speed, and the road that never ended. He destroyed his first marriage, wrecked cars, missed his children's birthdays, let down everyone who believed in him. He'd stood in rooms like this one, in the wreckage of his own choices, and wondered if there was a way back, if a man could fall that far and still find solid ground. There was. But it cost everything. It cost admitting the truth. It cost humility. It cost asking for help. It cost changing everything about the way he lived. But on the other side of that cost was something he'd lost and thought he'd never find again. Himself. "I'm not telling you what to do," Johnny said. "I don't have that right. But I'll tell you this: carrying that weight won't get lighter. Not with time. Not with distance. Not with anything you can buy or drink or tell yourself at 3 a.m. It'll just get heavier. And one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe 10 years from now, you'll wake up and realize you're not the man you thought you were. You're the man you chose to be when it mattered." Earl's breath came shallow. His eyes glistened in the diner's harsh light. "What if it's too late? What if I already made my choice and that's just who I am now?" Johnny leaned forward. His voice was low and steady, the voice of a man who'd walked through fire. "It's not too late. Not if you're still breathing. Not if you can still choose. Every morning you wake up, you get another chance to decide what kind of man you're going to be that day." The mechanic waved from outside. The bus was ready. The engine was running, rumbling low in the evening air. Johnny stood. He pulled a 20 from his wallet and left it on the counter, enough to cover both their coffees and the next 10 people who walked through the door. Earl looked up at him. And for the first time that night, there was something other than despair in his eyes. Something fragile and uncertain. Something like hope trying to find its footing. "You really believe that? That it's not too late?" Johnny met his gaze. Held it. Let the full weight of his own journey sit in the space between them. "I have to." He walked toward the door. His boots echoed on the linoleum. His hand was on the handle when Earl spoke again, his voice stronger than before. "Mr. Cash." Johnny turned. Earl stood now, his hands no longer shaking. "Thank you. For stopping. For listening." Johnny nodded once, slow and deliberate. Then he stepped out into the California dusk, where the sky had gone from copper to violet, and the first stars were beginning to appear above the distant hills. The bus rolled out 10 minutes later, gravel crunching under the tires. The band asked where he'd been. Johnny just shook his head and settled into his seat by the window, watching the diner shrink into a point of light in the rearview mirror, then disappear into the gathering darkness. He never saw Earl Hodges again. Never knew if the man went back to that factory the next night or walked away. Never knew if he found the courage to tell the truth or kept the lie locked inside where it would eat at him for the rest of his life. The days rolled on. The tour continued. Fresno, Reno, Portland, Seattle. Cities blurred together. Stages and hotel rooms and highways stretching endlessly forward. But 3 months later, on a Tuesday in June, a letter arrived at Johnny's manager's office in Nashville. No return address. Just a single page, handwritten on lined notebook paper, the handwriting careful and deliberate. "Mr. Cash, I don't know if you'll remember me. We met in a diner outside Bakersfield. You listened when you didn't have to. I went back to the company 2 weeks after we talked. Told them I lied in the report. Told them what really happened to Tommy. About the broken guard. About everything. They fired me on the spot. Some of the guys I worked with for 16 years won't talk to me anymore. My wife's scared about the bills. And I am too. But I can sleep now. I can look at my face in the mirror. I can hold my grandson without feeling like I'm lying to him, just by being in the room. I found Tommy's address through his brother. Wrote him a letter. Don't know if he'll ever read it or believe it, but I sent it. Thank you for reminding me who I was supposed to be. Earl." Johnny folded the letter carefully and placed it in his Bible. Between the pages of the Gospel of John, right next to a pressed flower June had given him and a photograph of his children. He carried it with him for years. Through tours and trials. Through the high points and the low valleys. Through the times when he needed to remember that one conversation in a forgotten diner could change a life. Some decisions don't make headlines. They don't get recorded or remembered or written into the history books. They don't win awards or earn standing ovations. But they echo in the life of one man who chose truth over comfort. In the quiet weight of a conversation in a roadside diner that no one else will ever know about. In the letter carried in a Bible through 1,000 cities. Johnny Cash never spoke about Earl Hodges in interviews. Never mentioned him on stage. Never turned the story into a song, though he easily could have. Some stories were too sacred for that. Too private. Too real. But those who knew him well, June, the band, the people closest to him said he kept that letter until the day he died. That sometimes, late at night on the bus, he'd take it out and read it again. A reminder that fame meant nothing compared to the moment you helped another man find his way back to himself. Because some stories aren't about fame or fortune or the roar of the crowd. They're about the moment a man decides what kind of man he's going to be. And sometimes, all it takes is another man who's been to the bottom and back to remind him he still has a choice. The bus kept rolling. The tour went on. Fresno came and went. Then Reno. Then 100 other cities. But in a small house 20 miles south of Bakersfield, a man named Earl Hodges learned to sleep again. And somewhere on a highway stretching toward the horizon, Johnny Cash carried that truth with him. Like a gospel, like a promise, like proof that redemption was always possible for anyone brave enough to reach for it.